Good morning. It is Wednesday, February 15, 2023, and we are about ready to call to order the council time for Clark County, Washington. I'll begin, however, by, after calling the meeting to order as we are now, asking if there is an amendment to the agenda from Kathleen.
Yes, Council, I would like to propose amending the agenda and adding under old business as 2.3 as the safe park location discussion.
And if there is no objection to that, it is added. And hearing no objection, that is our new 2.3. Okay, we move to public comment. This public comment is on agenda items only. Agenda meaning the council time agenda that is before you. Is there anyone staff that you see who wishes to speak?
Chair, we have one individual online. Caller, please go ahead, state your name and give your comment.
This is Kimberly Elbin, life citizen of Clark County. I'd like to say good morning. Kind of went through a little bit of a mental state yesterday, thinking about how this is affecting my health, what goes on, what I know is going on, and then citizens of America that took an oath that we trust they will follow that. We're finding out that they are not, and I find it very, very disturbing. I'm going to ask citizens to listen to FM radio 101.1, listen to it all day, every day, especially at noon until 4 o'clock for Lars Larson. People will be able to listen to the truth, what is really going on. I'd also ask people to listen to geoengineeringwatch.org. Also go to JBS, that stands for John Birch Society.org. That has a lot of information on there. I don't know if you saluted the flag today or had your prayer, but I'd like to say that when you salute the flag, that it's actually hypocritical of you to salute our flag. It's a one nation under God. It's indivisible with liberty and justice for all. And I don't see any of that. I don't see it here in Clark County. I don't see it in Vancouver.
Ma'am, I need to ask, what agenda item are
citizens.
you referring to this morning?
Well, I'm looking on here, and there is no agenda item other than that one about the ARPA, whatever it is. So it's kind of all of a mess. It really is. Your website, the agenda items. Anyway, there's not much to talk on that the public knows about. That's what I'm trying to say. But I do appreciate the public time to speak. So basically, I'm just trying to wake up Clark County so that I can carry on up in Olympia. Thank you, and God bless America.
Thank you. And staff, are there any others?
No, Chair, there's no others.
Old business. Is there a motion for approval of the minutes for February 8?
I move approval of the minutes of February 8th.
Second?
I second.
I'll second that.
It is seconded, and unless there is any change, edit, discussion, is there any? Then the minutes stand approved as drafted. Jail update. Should we ask Amber for this, Kathleen?
We do have the jail leadership team here. We have Dave Shook, Brian Pilikowski, and of course Amber as well. So if they want to come forward, they can provide the update this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair and Council and other staff members. Thank you for having us today to provide a little update on hiring and staffing and some of the safety issues that we're dealing with currently in our jail. So today we had 460 inmates inside of our Clark County Jail. We continue to manage those the best that we can with the current staffing levels. The first thing I wanted to talk about is our hiring process. We currently have 42 openings. 29 of those are officer openings. We've offered 2 jobs, and I believe they are finishing their psych and medical, and should they be successful with those, they'll be moving on into the actual hiring process. Brian and I today have interviews with another 6 applicants, and those will be hiring interviews, so should they be successful in those, that's another 6 folks. I wanted to just kind of update you on some of the different numbers. So we have 13 additional applicants for corrections officers that are in backgrounds currently. We have 37 that have also applied on Workday, and that's an addition. And then I think the last time I checked, we have about 230 people who've signed up in Indeed to show interest in wanting to be a corrections officer. So we're having quite a bit of success in getting people interested, and hopefully those will come to fruition as we filter those that probably should not be corrections officers or providing public safety here. So that's a significant part. One of the things that happened when we started to separate from the sheriff's office is, of course, we took employees in different workspaces like jail records. And so jail records is critically important, as those are the folks that process or paperwork so that people can either stay or leave our jail. And so as we continue to assess every position, we actually found a unfilled supervisor position there. So we've filled that appropriately to the supervisor level, and they're going to be overseeing about 20 different individuals doing all sorts of support tasks for the jail. And as we continue to identify those critical needs, the things that keep people inside or allow them to be released, or the public disclosures and some of those other tasks that the sheriff's office is no longer doing for us, we're going to make sure that we have enough staffing to accomplish that, so that first of all, we can get those folks out, but also keep us out of any liability concerns. So we've put those 2 supervisors into position. I think March 1st they'll take over what they're doing there. We've hired 6 individuals for jail records. That was our initial staffing, and we actually have 13 more that are available for interviews if we find additional positions that were actually in our folks that we need there. So we have a lot of folks that are actually interested in coming back from other departments around the county and elsewhere. So we're finding some great success in this jail services department and the new leadership as we continue on. Some of the other positions that are open currently, and just as you know, we have a mental health transition manager that is funded out of our mental health sales tax, and we have actually 8 applicants for that, so it's quite a significant number of folks that want to come take on that role. We have a jail discharge planner, and as you know, we've talked about reentry and other tasks that go along with having inmates in jail. And one of the things, because of COVID and the lack of staffing, is some of those programs have been mothballed or put aside because we've had to prioritize on the management of those inmates. And of course, having some of these additional staff members that are able to prioritize and focus on some of these additional duties will be very critical and helpful, especially as we continue to create those relationships with other stakeholders in the community, mental health and drugs and so forth. So we're seeing some really good opportunities there. Jail industries manager, logistics. So we spend millions of dollars every year on property and food and other items that the jail utilizes. And so the jail manager, the previous one left sometime last summer, and so we've had an interim up to this point, and we'll be hiring somebody for that position. One of the critical keys that we are going to initially be assessing is our food and our food services. So currently we have 8 food service coordinators and several temporary employees that cook food every day for our inmates. And one of the projects or assessments that we were left with as we took over was whether we continue with having our own staff or that we do an RFP and find a vendor to accomplish that. Both of those missions are very expensive. In fact, food costs went up about $500,000 this last year alone. So as you see in the public, it's also happening here associated with our facility. So You'll probably start seeing some of our new uniform patches and different badges on some of our officers as those have arrived from our vendors, and as our staff get those applied to their uniforms and different things, you'll start seeing that. Our shoulder patch is actually a rendering of our courthouse, an exceptional one by one of our employees who had put that together, and because of the history of Clark County, we decided that was appropriate for our patch on the side for the Clark County Jail. So, and then equipment. One of the things tasked by the county managers was to make sure our employees have all the right equipment to be safe and function as corrections officers, and we're moving quite quickly in getting all that. Very expensive tasers and things like that. Most of the employees have tasers that, and I don't know if you are familiar, those are the things that prongs and they allow electric shock and so forth. So those are tasers, and some of those and most of those actually were not fully functioning for most of our staff. So one of the priorities for me was to make sure that all of our staff have their appropriate equipment to make sure they're safe doing their job. So we'll be changing and making sure that happens over this next year. There'll be quite an expense to that, but it's definitely worth it for our employees. And really, the safety of our employees is one of the other key priorities that we have. Over the last month, we've had 3 fentanyl exposures, 2 internal inside of a cell or in a living facility inside the facility where our officers and staff and medical staff had to perform life-saving measures. And 1 was outside in our Sally Port as an officer from one of our local police agencies was bringing somebody to our custody. And so while you see the stories outside, it's also affecting us internally. And so as we look at different measures to try to eliminate that, whether it's changing of how our mail works or how we're doing different searches of different areas and things like that, we're looking at all aspects to try to really keep our employees and the inmates safe from those drugs that are killing people around the world. So I know as we continue to improve our efforts and our processes and those kinds of things, we'll be looking forward to some of the current modernized things that go along with officer safety and inmate management as we go. Throughout our last several weeks and months, we've been looking at this facility over here, and we've heard numbers like 800, 500, and I just told you we're at 460 inmates. But what is the right level of inmates? How many is that number? And it probably next month, I'm going to have a little bit more of a presentation for you on some of the housing and how that works so that you can be familiar with that. And I know that Councilor Marshall and Young and I think Gary Medved had already done tours. And if you haven't, I would implore you to come by and take a look. Deputy Director Pelikowski here does a fabulous job of showing history as well as where we're at currently and how that works. So we're going to be looking at all those aspects and really trying to paint a picture of what our current facility should be holding as far as inmates and where do we go from there. And so that will lead into those discussions for the new facility or remodel discussions that will be moving forward into the next several months. And so anyways, Amber or Brian, did you have any?
Chair, can I touch on something real quick? I think the team is incredibly humble about how aggressive they've been with the hiring process. We've hired more in the last 3 weeks than we have probably in a half of a year last year. And the amount of recruitment efforts that are going on, I think the team is incredibly humble with what they have accomplished in a month. And to have 13 people in background, 245, I think it was, through Indeed with our recruitment efforts and going outside of the traditional scope of how we have recruited in the past for law enforcement in our community. And I just can't express how much, and I'm grateful for our recruitment team, Keely, who's in HR, who's helping us with our efforts, and the team to be able to get our critical spots filled so that we can have the infrastructure set up to be able to expand on our program. So I just wanted to capitalize on the fact that they're being incredibly humble with the amount of efforts that they've accomplished in the last month. So I'm just incredibly proud, so I wanted to share that with you all.
Well, I just have a comment, and it was going to be right along the lines of what you just said, Amber. There are so many thank yous and congratulations to the team that are in order. But wow, this recruiting has surely near the top of the list, if not the top of the list. This is amazing in terms of results. And we know the challenges associated with recruiting, not just in law enforcement, but in law enforcement. And we know the challenges nationally and in Clark County. And you are topping them in ways that are just absolutely marvelous. We've been hearing bits and pieces as the days and weeks went along of what you're doing relative to recruitment. And it's obvious that it is paying off. And wow, congratulations and thank you for that. And I suppose that being humble, Amber, doesn't hurt any in that process of recruitment. That's great. Are there other things that you all would like to add, or questions or comments from council?
I'd like to add, I think it's astounding. I know when I took my jail tour, I think it was in May, that was a major issue, was staffing, and the hours that the deputies were working was very, very, very stressful, and spending all that time away from your family doesn't give much of a work-life balance. So I think this is absolutely great. I think that's going to take a lot of the stress off the employees. So that's fantastic.
Chair,
Yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to express my gratitude for having the opportunity to tour the jail, and I feel like I just scratched the surface and may want to have a follow-up tour at some time in the future. I really appreciate all your work on this. I would like to better understand the makeup of the inmate population, and maybe in a subsequent, or I could shoot you a list of kind of what I'm curious about. I would say just keep up the good work.
I believe that's really the presentation that I'll have for you next time, is kind of our annual report from last year, as well as what is our current makeup of inmates. And we were just talking about this yesterday in our classification system. It's an older classification system, and it needs to be updated with the complexities of today. Just COVID, while it's still not, it's affecting our facility still, is what I'll tell you, where we have to isolate. And oftentimes when groups of inmates come in, we isolate them initially in a holding area down below before they actually go up into the main housing areas. And it's to make sure that there's no sickness or other things going on. That same housing area takes care of any observations for fentanyl and other alcohol or addiction issues that might be happening at the same time. So there's a lot of safety and so absolutely, Councilor Marshall, and I appreciate all your support as far as that goes. And it's really a team effort here. Brian and I happen to be here reporting this to you, but we have a fabulous leadership and frontline staff that are working, like you said, 16 hours a day and doing fabulous work to do the best we can, and those things will improve. So,
Thank you.
Comments? Other comments?
Yeah, Chair, I've got a couple questions. Well, first of all, thank you for doing such a great job. I'm hearing nothing but good about what's coming out, and look forward to seeing it all come out. And thank you for your report. I was curious about and I assume, I know that there are certain things that we absolutely cannot prevent, but I'm just curious with the instances of the fentanyl coming in. Is there a process that you've worked through that, determining how it came in and seeing if it's possible to avoid it in the future?
So every aspect of the facility is supposed to be controlled at all times. There are times as inmates are moving around that they could easily have contraband, and ongoing checks of inmates and places and locations are definitely some of those things that need to happen. For about 3 weeks, a period of time, our body scanner was down, getting repaired. And so only some inmates you can actually strip search, and that's not allowed for everybody. And so there's contraband that comes in. We try to catch it the best we can. And again, there are some restrictions on who and how we can search, so that comes to part of it. Keeping and continuing to provide better attention to detail on some of the efforts. And because we have an indirect supervision system, sometimes it's hard to hear, see, and observe activities that might bring question to, like, what's going on here. And again, as we've had those opportunities to say, how do you see that? Now, we have cameras over most of the facility, and we can go back and see it secondarily or after the fact and learn from those. But as we continue to look at each of those events, and I'll just share a piece of information about one of those events is inmates in that living area actually were the first responders. They started giving CPR first aid to that inmate who was not breathing until our staff could get in there and take over from them. So they recognized there was an issue. And so as we look at the processes and the different systems and technology that may be helpful, it's making sure that we're using current modernized efforts for that. And you would be surprised on the methods that they're using to get drugs and narcotics inside of this facility, and we're trying to combat that strategically. So, and we'll continue to work on that.
And I realize that you can do everything perfectly right, and it can still happen. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And then I'm curious, where is the interest coming from? You said 230 people have expressed interest. Is it coming locally or further away? Do you know offhand?
You know, it's kind of interesting. In Workday, you can see how people are brought to Workday to apply, and there's actually quite a bit more internal employees that are saying, hey, the jail is hiring. Some are news reports or articles or social media. As far as where they're located, I don't have that data and information, but I can definitely bring that in one of my next conversations so we can kind of see. I believe corrections work is more localized. So you find those local folks. You're not generally, unless a family's moving to Clark County, are you going to find somebody from the East Coast looking for corrections work, right? So we're trying to pinpoint our efforts to local folks that would like to find a new career choice. And so, but Counselor, I can try to get some of that detail.
Well, it's more of a curiosity. So if it takes time, don't worry about it. But if it's something easy to come up with, I would be curious about it.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Yeah.
Dave, can you talk about the two efforts? So just so Councilor Young, we had one effort at JBLM a couple weeks ago. I think it was a couple weeks ago. Can you talk a little bit about Drew's efforts for JBLM?
Yeah, we have a light duty officer who is previously a recruiter, exceptional with these kinds of things, a former football player, I believe, is his. So he's quite a large individual, and he has been reaching out to avenues of approach that we historically had done and we're no longer doing, but also looking differently. And so JBLM, of course, is up in Seattle, Tacoma area, and they have career field days, things like that, where soldiers getting out of the military are looking for options. And so he reconnected there. I think for the next 4 months, we have days where we're scheduled to be up there with another dozen to 20 other occupations that are also trying to find employees. And so anywhere that there is a job fair, he is digging around looking for an opportunity, whether it's online, Battlegrounds having a career field here, I think next week or the week after, and again, we're trying to put folks there. One of the areas that we are looking for different avenues is gender-based. And so one of the issues in corrections work, and not all over, but our facility specifically, is we don't have a lot of female officers. And so sometimes we actually have one shift that doesn't have any. And so the law is very specific in searching and checking other, female inmates and things like that. And so we're trying to problem solve on how to make sure that we have enough female staff all through the shifts to make sure that we have enough. And so that's about recruiting. It's going out and finding those places where you might find females or other, depending on the genders. And we have lots of males females, that's not our issue. But again, trying to find enough of both genders to be able to make sure that we have our appropriate staffing. So you may hear some of that in the future as we're trying to problem solve that. So.
Are there any other comments or questions? And hearing none, I'd just like to say thank you all ever so much for being here. This was really an important update for council today. Thank you. And I guess it's time to move on. Have a wonderful day. We move to item 2.3, the Safe Park location. Kathleen?
Yes, so this is a follow-up to council's discussion probably about 2-3 weeks ago, where the city was asking, and I think Lindsay at the time was looking at different locations, property or that the county owns that could be used as a safe park location. And the question from council was based on a prior discussion with the city of Vancouver, they had offered some financial and staffing resources for those locations. I did follow up with their city manager, and he did recognize that initially the city was in a position to provide financial and staff support, but unfortunately they no longer have that capacity due to opening up their own parks within the city jurisdiction. They did say that they are willing to share information. They do have an RFP process that they went out to procure operators for the various sites that we can piggyback on. I will let council know we don't have any money budgeted specifically for a safe park in the county. And so my ask today from council, is this something that you want to pursue with the understanding that the city is not going to be providing any financial resources? And if so, then we can go back and work with the team to determine what we can do and what the financial resources would include for the county, since it's currently not budgeted.
My sense would be to put this on hold until there is an opportunity financially that presents itself in the future, which I'm sure there will be given the importance of dealing with this. Are there other comments, though, that either concur or disagree?
I
Chair?
concur also, Chair.
Thank you.
I would like to have a better understanding of what the need is outside of the city of Vancouver and potential locations, and equipped with that information, make a decision about priority for finding funding.
And that would be based on information that we currently have, I believe, because you have already discovered what facilities or land might be available, right?
So if I may, yeah, that information is readily available. It's mainly, obviously, a Vancouver-centric issue that the county aggravated a few years ago. We've had an ongoing problem with RVs illegally parked, RVs abandoned, and you can look south of the river and see that in earnest in a lot of locations. The county changed its code to try to address all the constituent complaints we were getting about illegal parking of RVs. And you drive around the county, you will see them. There were a number of articles about some of the private RV parks were simply full, charging way more than some people could afford. And some of them were in pretty poor, deplorable condition. You wouldn't want RVs parked there, but those were private vendors. So the issue was well known. They have waiting lists right now at the RV park that CTRAN has graciously provided land for. So the city or Vanessa or Michael could probably readily present that information to Sue Marshall or any new counselor that's unaware of the need. The need is there. But I want to highlight, it's not just finances. We're looking for a better way of doing things. You know, I'm not a cheerleader. You know, I think we needed the RV park that the city started out at the Vancouver Mall during the pandemic. They took it on. They stepped up with a potential solution. When they started reopening the mall, they had to move that parking. It went to CTRAN. CTRAN hasn't told us when they're going to close that, but they will want that property back. They have signaled that clearly. This isn't in perpetuity. So the need is there, but the point I want to make is, and you can look at the records at the existing RV park that Vancouver's operating. There are people there since its inception. So to me, from my point of view, the cheerleading part, I don't support that. We need to provide an area that's safe for parking. It should be for a few days until something else can be figured out. No more than a few weeks, maybe a few months, but it should not be a year or longer that people are now just set down a lifetime claim to a parking spot, because that's not getting at solving the solution, and it then becomes a permanent solution, not a temporary fix. So operating these parks is a challenge, and there's a lot of costs, and we saw that, and it's still going back and forth between the city and the county as to how much this stuff actually really costs to provide a safe environment. It isn't just a postage stamp of available land in a good location near transportation and services that can be safely monitored. There are a lot of costs, and we need to go into that with open eyes and with a lot of transparency so we know what those costs will be and what the challenges are. So, yeah, I agree, Madam Chair, we need to pause this, but the need is very well documented and known, and we need to have an open mind to stepping up in the future, because we should. We have a role in this, and the problem is out in the county, it's in the other cities. It is, although most dense in Vancouver has a more acute problem, it is a county issue. So I do look forward to further discussion, but I think based on what the manager has discovered, I think we need to pause for right now.
So thank you.
Chair.
And unless there are other comments, I believe that answers your question, Kathleen, right?
Yes, Chair, I do have a couple more comments.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. You know, I agree with the majority of what's been stated by the other counselors. However, I do disagree with the pause. And the reason being is if we know that the need is there, we just got to make it happen. I mean, we can park things and they just sit there and they fester. And I think this is a really important, critical issue. I think one of the things that we should do is collaborate with the city of Vancouver. We don't have to follow their model exactly. We can certainly have our own, controls and goals with the facility, but I also feel like there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And they are a great resource for us to be able to get something like that set up. That having been said, I do agree that we need to get this right. And I don't believe in opening up a facility without having everything figured out. So I just don't, I'm okay with spending time to figure out this process. I just don't want to pause and have no progress. So those would be my comments.
Thank
Chair,
you.
I
Yes,
have
go
a
ahead.
question. Councillor Mebaji, I was just interested in, you mentioned that some of those RVs have been parked there since it opened. Do they have some kind of process, or are they planning to have some kind of process where those people do have a plan and like there's only a certain amount of time that they can stay there so that it isn't permanent, so that they can have, permanent housing?
So the thought behind these locations, whether it's camping or RV parking, is that it makes for easy access for service providers to come and make contact. And that is happening and there have been some anecdotal successes. So the simple answer is yes, there is some effort, but it's kind of like the HUD Housing First model. You know, yeah, you can reach out, you can provide services, you can try to come up with a plan, but ultimately they're just allowed to stay if there is no plan put in place.
Okay.
So that's the downside of it. That's the part that needs to be fixed. Otherwise, we'll be not treading water, but underwater as the growing population of homeless continues. And I need to also mention one other thing. You know, we have a lot of churches out there that have stepped up and provided RV parking as well throughout the county and in the rural county as well. But that's very limited. And the issue that the county had in passing its code is the same that the churches have, and also the safe parking. These RVs are hazardous waste dumps at some point. When they are abandoned, most of them have asbestos and other issues with them that make, that then become an extraordinary expense. And that's the issue that confronted the county, to have them towed and disposed of. So the churches, you know, you have to have, and the city requires it too, an operable, looks like it's in good shape, late model RV, so they have a good chance that it will be driven away and not just dumped on the city or county to have the expense of having to dispose of it. There's a lot of issues here. But to answer your question, I think the city is making some effort in their programming at each of their locations to bring services, just as we are here to our PSC building, and we have outreach coming. Ultimately, there are enforcement issues that we need to get to when services are turned down. So there is no timeline in any of these facilities, hardstand or safe communities or RV parking. There are no timelines. So, and there was a Columbian article months ago about basically the 1-year anniversary of a couple of the residents at the C-Tran facility. I don't think that should exist. We need to figure out how to make sure they do move on to something better.
Chair?
So at this point, Kathleen, you have your 3 thumbs up, so I believe we're ready to move on. Unless there's anything you'd like to add.
Chair, I have a comment. I think
Go ahead,
rather
Councilor.
than just a total pause, what if we develop some scenarios and begin to wrestle with some of these issues that we've talked about and figure out, you know, what level we might be willing to commit to, or if at all, but it would be good to have some, you know, idea of degrees of help, since we've identified that it's a countywide problem.
Are you speaking of the safe park locations only, or homelessness in general?
Well, both.
But I have a suggestion, Madam Chair, because we did identify 4 potential properties. There is a pending tour that we were waiting to organize or not for ECHO membership to take a look at, just to kind of get a lay for the land, just to physically see what could be potentially available. Maybe I could get together with Councilor Marshall and perhaps organize something. I'm not sure who the lead was on that effort, whether it was Parks and Rec to identify those 4 parcels, or whether it was Michael or Vanessa. But maybe we could, because there's expression, especially on the City of Vancouver councilors, to at least see what the county was originally teeing up. I would think that could be a next step that we should at least do, and then perhaps that'll generate some ideas on Councilor Marshall's part on how we can do this better. And
I would really appreciate that.
Chair?
I think Kathleen has been wanting to speak.
Oh, my apologies.
No worries.
That's okay. I
Um,
just can feel it.
No, I was just going to answer Councilor Mevagee's question. I believe it was Lindsay and some public works staff that were looking at the properties. One of them I have pause on, and that's the fairground location, because they constantly have events going on. So, and I have not talked to the CEO out there to determine if there's a good location that won't impede on their operations and services. I think one of the properties that was also brought forward was not one of our properties. It was one that was for sale. But we can get that list again and get that in front of council so that if you want to go out and take a look at the locations.
Thank you. Councilor Young?
Yeah, I'm just a little bit unclear here what our direction is to the county manager. I would suggest perhaps, I feel like the majority here do support having a facility such as this in our county, and I would suggest setting a goal of perhaps, actually having one open within 6 months or within a year. I don't know what's reasonable. But
I
if we don't,
appreciate your perspective, Counselor, but I don't know where you're getting the idea that the majority of council wants to have a county facility. Where are you getting that?
well, I perhaps I misunderstood my fellow councils, but it sounded to me that Councilor Marshall and Councilor Medvegee were supportive.
Okay, so with the caveat, one, we don't have the funding. That's a big caveat. And also, I think I can fairly say that county staff is not in favor of this at all. It's a huge amount of work that takes the right vendor to operate, and I would say there's some history in Vancouver of having a very, very poor contracts and very poor outcomes with some of these facilities from the Navigation Center forward, although they seem to have avoided a lot of the pitfalls from previous failures. So what I am saying is, let's keep the conversation open. Let's look for ideas. Let's do the tour of, it sounds like we may only actually have 2 properties, not 3 or 4 to look at. But as far as committing staff time to coming up with a plan, until we see what this legislative session has outcomes, we just had this presentation, we're losing at least 40% or more of our funding because of recording fees dropping way off this past year. And I see Mark sitting out there, so he's well aware of this. So we have a huge shortfall for funding our homeless support systems that are presently in place. In fact, it was raised that we'll probably have Michael and Vanessa come to us and ask to repurpose some of the ARPA money that we had committed for other homeless services to go to backfill these lost recording fees. So funding is a tremendous challenge right now, and so we can't really just say we're going to build something in advance of knowing where the funding is. I think that would be a waste of staff effort.
Chair, one quick question, if I may.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I know that we are I recall having this discussion that we're going to be addressing ARPA funds in the future, and from my understanding, there may have been still some unallocated funding, and I'm just wondering if a safe park would be a potential project that could be funded by those.
I see Mark saying yes, and we do have ARPA funding next on our agenda, but I agree that he's supportive, but I think we need to look at the guidance because there have been a couple other items that we just want to make sure it follows within the aspects of ARPA funding. And I think we have to have a direct tie to COVID and the pandemic. And, so we can, Mark and his staff can look into that to see if there is a tie, and we will talk about ARPA funding here shortly.
Great, thank you.
Madam
Is
Chair,
there-
I did see
Yes.
you talking before Kathleen, but we couldn't hear anything. I think you were on mute.
And if I can
You're right,
too,
I
just.
was, but I was going to say the same thing that Kathleen did, so she's
Yeah,
got it.
and I also want to just remind council on ARPA funding, that is one-time funding. It is not intended to support ongoing programs, because if we do that, then we're going to have to cut a program when the funding is done.
Okay, we have talked about that and could talk about it for the rest of the day because there is so much on both safe parks and homelessness to discuss always. Have we covered it sufficiently for today, Kathleen?
I guess I need clarification on what the pause includes. Are we just pausing for now, or do you want staff to start looking at, I'd say pause for now, knowing that there's going to be visits to some of the locations, or do you want staff to do any work in looking at options moving forward, or just wait until we hear back from council?
So first and foremost, I understand the county manager is meeting with the Vancouver city administrator to kind of nail down what the true costs are, because we still have a delta in what reality is on what it costs for these facilities. Yes, I would like you to resolve that. I think we should plan on supporting a tour for the ECHO team and anyone on the council that wants to do it, me included. You know, I've been encouraging all along that our staff regularly meets with Vancouver staff and talk about these issues. We have a role here. We can't hide our heads in the sand. We need to come up with a partnership with all the cities, including Vancouver. There is a need. And yes, there are ARPA funds that we could repurpose or reallocate. And the reality is too, some of this is just plain capacity. I mean, we sequestered, if you will, $15 million as a quick and forceful infusion during the pandemic to address the homeless situation. And I was very hopeful. We allocated $5 million to shelter alone. That would help put a serious dent in the situation we're in right now. The last I heard, and perhaps Mark can clarify this as well, of that 15 million, we had, or maybe it was of the 5 million, we had only spent about 1 million, and that's a capacity issue. Being able to actually spend the money that we have within the time frame that we have. These are all challenges that we need to look. So I would like, certainly I want to know that $15 million is spent in the way we envision to put a serious dent in our homeless situation, including that $5 million allocated for shelter space. A lot of it went to ongoing costs and replaced other funds. I know there's a counter narrative to that, but I haven't seen a whole lot of hotels bought or buildings going up or safe parks that the county has funded. So I'm not sure that the policy goal is being fulfilled, even as it is with the money we've allocated under ARPA. So we need to keep looking at that and figure out, okay, what can we do differently? What can we do faster? And shelter. I mean, it is the center of all the issues that we have. And that includes everything from hotel vouchers to rent subsidies to diversion programs. We have a serious problem here that's only going to continue to get worse unless we step up.
You had asked Kathleen for clarity and gave two alternatives. My perspective would be that we should go with the former and not ask staff at this point in time to be searching for other safe park locations until council would give different and further direction. And that could involve a number of things, including finances available to support that effort. But we'll see,
Chair-
because council can put those directions together in the future when they see needed. That would be my perspective on direction for staff at this time. Yes, was that Councilor Marshall?
Yes, thank you. I guess from my perspective, a lot of issues have been raised, but just having, if Lindsay were here, I would say that would be great assignment for her to maybe develop a white paper of kind of pros and cons and options as those come to, and maybe they're known already. But I guess without some kind of more concrete information, it's difficult for us to make a decision. So if there was an ability for some staff time to be used to kind of clarify what some of these options, and maybe just looking at safe parks initially, but in my mind, knowing that there's other options that we may want to pursue. And funding is one issue, and a big issue, an important issue, but without really understanding, from a policy perspective, where we want to go, what our vision is, what to address the need, then we could make decisions about how we want to spend the money. But I think informing the policy first would be helpful.
So a proposal for council's consideration. As Councilor Mevaji already mentioned, I am having a meeting with the City of Vancouver, including Vanessa and Michael, to go over the costing so that we can ask questions, because I think there's a lack of clarity, and we don't want to have that discussion in public. It's not adversarial. I actually do meet with the city manager regularly, and I know Vanessa meets with some of the city staff regularly as well. So they have agreed, so we're going to be scheduling something in the next week or two to talk about their funding model, and because there are some questions that we have, it's not clear in the data that they're providing. So we'll have that discussion. Council can go on the tour, and I can talk to Vanessa, because she does have a history with some of these parks and prior work that she has done, I believe, in Las Vegas, if I remember correctly. So I can work with her and Michael to see if they can do like a pros and cons, what works, what doesn't work, based on their own experiences in managing these programs. And then we can bring that back to council all at once and then present that information, and then you can determine what path you want to move forward and what your vision is in moving forward. I was going to say one other thing with Vanessa, but I can't remember right now what that was. Does that work? Chair,
That
are you
sounds
comfortable
great.
with that approach? Okay.
Yes, I think that's exactly what we were saying, and that includes the idea that staff is not looking for additional sites at this time. Yeah, so with that in mind, are we ready to move on to new business?
Just one last question, I apologize. Could we possibly publicize when council goes to make sure that we can all go to look at the properties if that does happen?
Yeah, we can put it on the weekly calendar, so it would just have to be noticed on the weekly calendar if there's more than 3 counselors.
Great, thank you.
I didn't understand there, Councilor Young. Were you suggesting that the public also go on these tours?
Well, I don't think we can particularly exclude the public, but what I was suggesting is that we publicize it so that more than 2 counselors can be present.
Oh, yes, of course. For if 5 wanted to be present, I would think that would be fine. But I was just questioning that this was being
Okay,
suggested
so-
as a public tour.
That's a new twist, and we've never actually done that. What we've
No.
done in the past is have tours like at Camp Bonneville. We had tours set up for 1 or 2 counselors at a time and had multiple tours. I think there's going to be a lot of challenges logistically if we announce this as a public meeting.
So you can't, so it won't be announced as a public meeting. It would be similar to, like, if you went to a conference. We put it on a weekly calendar, so there's not access for the community to watch or join. But there is caution. If there's going to be 3 at one of these sites, you cannot deliberate and have discussions regarding potential policy decisions. And I think that may be difficult when you're having a tour, because you're all there with that mindset and trying to see what could work or what can't work. So thinking about more, I would actually recommend that you only have 2, just so that you don't inadvertently get sideways with OPMA.
Yeah, that reminds me of tours we would do as a court, as a jury. You go to a crime scene and you instruct every juror, do not talk. Don't talk at all. Don't talk to anyone. Don't ask any questions. And that's the situation we would have. So it is far simpler just to have one or two counselors at a time and avoid the topic entirely.
Okay, are we finished with that now? I think we have covered that well. And let's move on to new business and the ARPA grant fund balance projection from inception through the fourth quarter.
Good morning, Council. Sounds like this is a timely discussion. We didn't
Yes,
plan it
indeed.
that way, but I guess for the record, Mark Gasaway, Finance Director. I wanted to come before you today just to give you a summary of where we're at with our ARPA spending, our ARPA fund, and to talk a little bit about some of the commitments so far, and let you ask questions. And then at the end, if I forget, I have one thing that I need to bring forward concerning ARPA that we need to take care of for last year still. So the column, you should be familiar with this, I hope. The columns, basically what has been committed, what has been spent, and then what is remaining from those commitments. At the bottom, if you scroll down just a little bit, Kristen. Yeah, so what this section is, and I'm just briefly going to go over this. This is what we've brought over from what's called our revenue recovery. Those funds come into the general fund, and then they're able to be used for general government purposes. Right now, we have two commitments against those funds. One is the down payment assistance program, which was approved by council, and then facilities space planning. So you don't see those listed as a project in the ARPA fund any longer because we've moved those funds over and we'll be paying those out of general fund. So, Kristen, thanks. If you go back to the top. So you can see the major categories of funding. You can see that this year we're actually beginning to spend quite a bit quicker. Last year was programmatic. We were developing these programs, making the requests, and just to talk a little bit about the last discussion, there were a lot of funds set aside for housing, for affordable housing, for community services. However, at the same time that they made that request, they also received significant dollars in emergency rental assistance. And to their credit, they were able to process huge amounts of emergency rental assistance, up to $50 million, which was significant. So now that that program has somewhat subsided, you can see that they're now beginning to spend the ARPA money that was designated for them. So I know that we talk about capacity and the ability to process this funding. It is because we don't have staff that actually does the programs, that we actually manage the programs, and we have service providers that actually spend the money. So as you go through this, you can see that we're starting to spend the money. There's been some significant progress made, especially in the last couple of months of where this money's spent. I just wanted to point out a couple of projects because we've been so involved in these. One is the community grant program. The council set aside $2 million for community grants. We received, I believe, around 35 applications, and we made 26 grants associated with that program. All of that funding now has been dispersed. It takes a while. We're learning a lot as we manage these programs ourselves. But those 26 different programs have received various amounts of funding, and that has all been dispersed. Another program that has been, I think, very beneficial to the community is the North Country EMS facility. They've broken ground out there. I don't know if you've been out there or driven by lately, but that funding has been instrumental in getting that project off the ground and the ability to complete that project. So you don't see any dollars spent on that yet. However, we just began accepting invoices as of January of this year. So as they go throughout this year, you're going to see that funding spent down. So any particular questions on any of these?
So if you could remind the council and our new councilors too, what is the timing
Yes.
for finally expending it all or sending it back to?
So the program guidelines say that it has to be committed by the end of 2024. So that's the 2 years from now, end of next year. It has to be spent by the end of 2026. So we have time. I'm not concerned about the spending side of it. I think we'll have that taken care of. I'm not concerned about the committed side, to be honest. So I think we'll be able to work through that. One of the things that we've begun, our grant coordinator has done is with some of the larger commitments, we've gone back and begin discussing, well, it's been a year and a half since those commitments were made. Are they still valid? And anytime they have determined, well, we got state funding for that, so we want to repurpose that. We, as guidelines, have told them any repurposing of funding needs to come back to council. So they're not, for example, I know that Public Health has made a statement that, well, we got state funding for something, so we want to repurpose that. In that situation, any repurposing of funding comes back to council. So we don't say, okay, if it's a public health use, yeah, go ahead and do it. It has to come back to council and be reapproved. So you will see any of these readjustments. For example, you talked about community services repurposing. That will need to come back to council so that you're all able to see that and approve that. We need to have in our documentation specific council approval for these funds, and we require that. And so if something changes through any of these commitments, you will see that.
So if I could just ask a couple questions, one to bridge from the previous discussion and also look forward to what I hope to get into in council reports. The broadband expansion, $4.65 million. I thought that was, the contract was finally solidified, done, and that should have been.
So I believe that's the Comcast contract. And so I met with Comcast last week, so we're on track to get that contract done.
Okay, so that's still moving forward. Now, drilling down into the $15.5 million for the housing.
Councilor, can I just address that real quick?
Please.
One of the reasons why you may not see expenditures on that, we don't send the money. They have to be able to send us the invoices, just like North Country. So even when the contract's done, that contract may be executed, but they will need to be sending us the invoicing or the actual expense side of things.
Okay. Thank you for that. On the $15.5 million, we had, notionally divvied it up into different areas of addressing the homelessness. $5 million for shelter space. You show roughly $3.3 million spent or committed well, you have it actually as spent, of the 15.5. Within, if you have the data, within the shelter space category, how much have we actually committed?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but we can,
fair enough.
We can find out that report. I don't know if Michael or Vanessa's on, but they might be able to answer that.
But until it's actually spent or at some point legally committed, we can repurpose the
Absolutely.
funds.
And you can see that right now, even with all of the commitments that have been made, there's still a small amount, I mean, $9.4 million that has not been committed specifically for any of the projects. So that is something that council may want to consider. Do we ask for another time period of requests? So it may be the spring of this year or sometime, depending on what council would like to do.
Well, and we had talked about another round of nonprofits and small business.
Exactly.
And ARPA grants.
And what we like to do is have a time period set where the requests come in so that we can evaluate those all at the same time, rather than just singularly. So if that's something council wants to do, we could set up a time to receive requests, and another additional amount for a grant program could be one of those requests.
And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, this is the last thing. So first of all, I'm supporting another round of ARPA funding for nonprofits and small businesses. I'm hoping we do that. We had originally talked about, we're going to have a second year grant round, and then it kind of just pushed off to the side. The YMCA, we fenced money for that. Is that kind of dead in the water? Is it still percolating? Can we repurpose that, or we talk about committing it?
You'll notice that you don't see it on the list. And part of that is because in our working with that request, the request was made and we kind of earmarked it, but it was never committed. We have worked with them a lot and tried to help them put their request in a suitable format so that they could be eligible, but we've not been able to get that from them. So I'm not going to say it's dead in the water. That's kind of a metaphor that I'm not willing to go with. But
Yeah, and as Mark said, that's exactly what, they're responsible to share with us how it's eligible under ARPA, and they have not done that.
So, and we've given them an example of an organization that's done that and a template to do that, and we've received neither.
Yeah, thank you for all that effort. It would have been one of those greater community legacy items if it could have come through, and I know Battleground Council is now waiting on what we're going to do. So that that amount is in the uncommitted grant of
Yes.
$9.41 million right now. Okay, thank you.
Got a question real quick. Are all of these for capital expenses only?
No. A lot of them are program service related.
Okay.
Very few are capital related. There's another standard of requirements that goes along with capital items, and so we've not done a lot of that. Clearly the North Country EMS facility will be a capital item, but there's a whole additional layer that we have of documentation and reporting for capital projects.
So I guess my question would be, what long-term expenses do we have that we might potentially be able to use this for? And the reason I ask that is, it comes to an issue of like capacity. There's only so much capacity, and it's like any business, when they're operating on a certain amount of revenue, when a giant source of revenue comes in, they don't have the capacity to use that properly. Mm-hmm. And so I would be interested in seeing what long-term needs the county has that we might be able to use these funds for.
But remember, this is one-time funding, so if we start a program that requires ongoing funding, by 2026, we're not going to have that funding any longer.
Right. I was thinking more like capital expenses, and like whether we could use some funding for a jail and things like that.
And that is.
And we've done that.
Here.
If you look at, sorry, Kristen, if you scroll down a little.
It's the $17 million for facility space planning, but also didn't we move some money over to general fund for the engineer and architect?
Scroll down just a little bit.
And we had a lot of
facility
discussion
space
about
planning.
that as to what that amount would be. And
Yeah.
I think another example that's worthy of mentioning, and it's getting some further discussion among the cities, is what our treasurer had proposed, and it was a long-term investment to help
Down payment assistance.
low-income buyers. So that is hopefully going to be in perpetuity. That was an investment by ARPA funds into that program.
So, Councilor Young, if you see, there's the $10 million right there on the facility space planning. That's for the architectural, engineering and architectural
Yes,
study.
it's the architect and engineer to evaluate the jail work center, and juvenile to look at what we can do to expand and get the facility up to standards.
Right. And then if you go back up to the top, Kristen, you'll see another 17 million, and that's for once we have that information available, what, the actual moving of walls or whatever it needs to be done. And we have identified certain projects
Okay.
that we need to do within the county that will be using some of this funding.
Okay. Is there any new ones since this was talked about last year? Are there any other new expenses that we're aware of?
Yeah, and that's
We
what I
weren't
guess
at the time.
I was asking council if they'd like to do, because occasionally we'll get requests, but we don't only bring those to council when you're ready for those. So
Yeah.
if you're interested in seeing what other ideas or whatever proposals are out there, we could set a date later this spring and say, here's some projects that have been proposed. Would you like to consider those? And then talk about those.
I think that's a great idea. And in addition, I'd like to suggest that now we go ahead and kind of set in place the timing for applications for another, say, 2 million for the community grant program for nonprofits and small business. That would double what we already had. And there were 35 apps, you said, and 26 grants. So it appears that there is strong interest in that program. And I know I got quite a bit of email on that saying that there was a wish that more ARPA funds were used for the community-based program. So I think it's that all of that is consistent, and I'd like to see us go ahead with that planning now.
And just to clarify too, and I may have not remember correctly, do you want to look at community grants for nonprofit and small business, or only nonprofits? Because I thought that was part of the dialogue before.
So a couple of points. One, I give a thumb up to what Karen just said. I think we can move ahead by giving some specific direction. So the problem with the first grant round will be the problem with the second grant round if we do it the same way. You know, we allocated $2 million and we bunched small business together with nonprofits. And as a committee member, oh my God, these are apples and oranges. How do you rate small businesses, you know, a pizza, a bakery compared to someone that's saving lives, providing health care? So I suggest we have the 2 million, roughly, I'm just throwing that out as a swag, but a separate round for nonprofits, a separate round for small businesses, because small businesses, you know, we only awarded a few because they just didn't compare real well.
In that round, but
In that round.
the year previously, we had set aside 10 million of CRF money, and all 10 million went to small businesses. So
Right.
we have addressed small businesses to some extent.
No, I understand. It was, and quite frankly, it came from constituents saying, hey, you've completely left out nonprofits, and that's what generated the discussion to have it. So,
would you want to divide the 2 million, like a million each, or, I mean, we can do whatever you council would like. And
I certainly am open to whatever the council wants to do on that, but I think first and foremost, we need another round of about 2 million, whether it's 2 million for nonprofits and then $1 million for small businesses. I don't know. You know, that I'll leave that up. But I did want to comment on what Kathleen said. So that 10 million that we ended up with first started as, I think, a $40 million request, and the council was a little tepid about that. But since then, even though it was in discussion, you know, jail services hadn't really come to fruition yet. Our ARPA discussion really preceded that. And since then, now we've got jail services, we've talked about mental health care, whole new programs. We already identified, hey, we need some new meetings, we need a new Sally Port. You know, so perhaps I would reflect back to the county manager and said, now that we have jail services and we're getting a little bit more fidelity as to what facility changes, modifications, additions we're going to need, perhaps we need to revisit that $10 million amount.
Well, I don't think right now it's changing the need for the architect and engineer. That discussion, regardless where jail services ended up, will come back to the council, and that will determine what funding do we need, what is recommended, what's available on moving walls, doing internal rehab or remodel versus adding on like a one-story on the backside of the jail. So I don't think that's going to change at all, and that 10 million is specific for that architect and engineer, which is what we need to determine what
other costs?
additional financial money that we need moving forward. And I also have one quick question on, I believe when the council spoke at the end of last year regarding the small business grants, wasn't it Department of Commerce that was doing their own funding?
that's
Can
correct.
we get a list of who applied and was awarded funding through that process? Because I think the council didn't solidify on that next round, knowing that the state was doing it, so that way we can ensure that there's some.
I can make that request and find out if anyone from Clark County had applied, because they had millions. It was like 70 million or something.
It was part of the application process to disclose that voluntarily, but, so I would make a motion, Madam Chair, if it's appropriate, to at least for now, let's give a thumbs up on an additional nonprofit grant round of 2 million, and perhaps we can revisit the idea of small business and whether that would be a good and beneficial use in addition to all the other money that had flown in over the last couple of years. I mean, we've been reading newspaper articles about small businesses that, you know, everyone misses stuff, and there's still a lot of small businesses that are still struggling that missed all of those monies available through Commerce. So anyway, I just throw that out there if we're ready to move forward, at least on a nonprofit round.
I'm certainly ready, and I would give it the thumbs up. So if the proposal had also been another million towards small business, by the way, I'd give that a thumbs up too, because some funds have clearly gone that way, but like you were saying, more are needed. So, you know, for right now, it is on nonprofits, 2 million. You agree?
I have a question. I'm just wondering if that 2 million was enough in the first round. And of those 35 applicants, the ones that did not receive funding, is it that they did not meet the criteria, or did we simply run out of money?
A lot of it were criteria based. I mean, they have to be eligible, and so qualifying them may or may not have happened. I mean, some of them were, I mean, to be honest, maybe less, I don't know how I want to word this correctly, maybe less impactful.
That's why you have criteria. Sometimes it's a yes and sometimes it's a no.
Yeah, and so, you know, we just.
I mean, there was a wide array, and just to give some made-up examples, we had organizations that weren't going to have that great of an impact. They had an operating budget of like 30,000, and they were asking for a $2 million grant.
Yeah.
To kind of quadruple and grow, and we just really.
Yeah, and the point is not to grow a business. The point is to replace potential losses that they had during COVID, right? And so we had to look at the eligibility requirements and then make sure we were evaluating them based on what services they were providing or had to maybe eliminate and or needed to sustain the current level of services. So
Right.
it's just not, well, you apply and we'll send you money. I mean, I know
So that's
kind
good.
of
That's
facetious.
good. That, as it should be. I'm just trying to assess if the 2 million is about the right amount.
It is if that's what the council says.
Well, based on the demand.
Oh, well, I can't answer that question.
We can always come back as well to share how many applications, how many are eligible, and what the dollar amount is if council wants to add additional money.
Yeah, and we need to based on our prior experience, fine tune what we were offering, because, you know, you did get grants asking for $10,000 and then $2 million, which was the whole budgeted amount. So, I mean, we need to kind of put it out, shape what we're offering in the way of grants. And so that was a big learning lesson.
We did learn a lot.
Well, I would be supportive, and I think better to move forward so that we can allow applicants enough time to get that process rolling.
We found that it is a longer process than we originally thought. We need to have time for applicants, but then the evaluation process, and then the documentation process, and then the actual, qualification. It took us probably 6 months or so before we actually got funding out the door, so.
And then the notice is the big thing. And I had a specific example of that with the NAACP. They wanted to submit a grant and didn't because they missed the whole thing. And so I don't know how we better put the word out into the community to make sure all of the nonprofits at least have notice of it. I mean, we do need to, it's always a challenge.
So I would definitely be supportive of this, and I think that's a good idea is to just say 2 million, but then we'll take a look at it when the applications come in, and we could adjust if we feel like the need is there. I would like emphasis on making sure those that didn't get a grant in the past are prioritized, if they're eligible, of course, and if they still meet that criteria. I was curious, though, is this conversation just about that, or were we looking at allocation of the other 7.4?
Well, and that was the question that I had. Would you like us to begin a receiving requests or soliciting receipt of requests for the additional amount? And because we try and evaluate those together so that if we have more requests than the amount available, then you can prioritize, right? Rather than one-offs. It sounds like the community grant program is the high priority, so we're going to go with that, and we'll begin working on that now. But with the other requests, we can collect those.
I would say yes on the other requests, with particular emphasis on the jail.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you just said, Madam Chair, because you had mentioned small business. So if we're going to go with $1 million on nonprofits, do we also want to have a second round for just small business in the same amount?
We certainly could, which is a different question. I had suggested, relative to Mark's question, that yes, we go ahead and identify those additional needs with particular emphasis on the jail.
Okay. So we'll look into internal county requests with emphasis on the jail.
And I guess I have one final question for council as well. I think Councilor Meviji was part of this grant process. I would recommend that we still have a counselor be present, and if
absolutely
as part of the review process for the grants that are received. It does come back during the budget process, I believe, for the full council's consideration, but to be part of the evaluation.
Right.
Definitely. And that was Councilor Meviji before, correct?
Yes, I did it before, and quite frankly, unless staff objects, it would be good to have two counselors on board to reflect the policy aspect of our input.
I'd be interested. I've had experience evaluating grants and all of that process.
So Councilor Marshall is one.
And Mark, can you remind us who else was on the evaluation team?
Myself, our program coordinator. We brought in community services. Michael Torres helped. And so we're trying to get some breadth of.
And your grant hire, is that a 2-year position? Because she was a godsend.
Yeah, we extended her through the budget process.
Yeah, we extended her to the end of the grant now because we found out we will need her.
I'd be interested in being involved as well if the opportunity is there.
Yeah, so I lost my position on the mental health sales tax grant round, so I would like to stay on this one if I could.
That's
together with Councilor Marshall.
up to the council.
And I give that a thumbs up if that kind of
So we have-
solidifies the team.
Yeah, so Chair, we have 3 counselors who are interested. We can't have more than 2.
Well, I was going to say, because the conversations are with staff, I think we could manage it where they're not collaborating, as long as they're not collaborating outside.
We have to notice the meeting.
Oh, would you?
I would, yes.
Okay.
So I would recommend only 2, and I would also, yes. So we have 3 that are interested, Counselor Marshall, Counselor Mevigi, and Counselor Young.
I'd like to stick with Counselor Medvigi, who has the experience on this now. And the next person who spoke up was Counselor Marshall. So I would say those 2 at this time, and maybe for a later project, it could be expanded with additional people, additional
And
counselors involved.
what if we did this with the community grant program? We'll set that up as one, and then the business as a separate, and then maybe Counselor Young could do one or the other. Would that be
That
reasonable?
would be great. I don't know if Council Bowerman, because business is her forte, whether she would want to be the second counselor on that committee.
Are we looking at the nonprofits at this point, Mark, or?
He proposed the second round for small business.
Have different counselors than the nonprofit.
Okay, and we may move to that later, correct? We're not there just yet.
I think in order for staff and Mark to move forward, it would be good to have the counselors identified because they actually help in the formation of the criteria and the RFP before it goes out to the public.
Well, I'd love to have a program that is geared to the small business, given their interest in ARPA funds. In the previous round, I think it would be terrific to do that. So if the rest of the council is supportive of that, let's go ahead and I would say at the $1 million level.
I think you're getting a lot of head nods on that proposal. So 2 grant rounds, 1 million for nonprofits, 1 million for small business, 2 counselors on each committee.
Oh, I had heard 2 million for the community grant program. A million here,
Yes.
$1 million there.
2 million for the nonprofits and 1 million for the small business.
Fair
Is
enough.
that what you heard too?
Yeah, and if we don't allocate it all, it just gets
Right.
repurposed again.
Right. So the counselors interested then in the small business, as you suggested,
Counselor Young.
you're right. I would very much like to be on that group. And who else would like to serve on that if 2 are still advisable?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, Counselor Young
Perfect.
and Bowerman.
So before we move on, any other questions on any of this? Because I have one item I want to make sure that I bring back to council before I finish. No more
I
questions?
think we need to go ahead and finish. So go ahead with the next item.
Yeah.
I think we need to fish and cut bait at some point with the YMCA. That was something I was championing, but if it's not going to happen, we need to get the earmark off of it and make sure that
There is no
repurpose
earmark
it.
on here. It was included in the 9.41 million, so we're good.
Yeah. I did have one item that I just kind of a heads up for council. As we've been going through our documentation, because we're trying to be very tight on this, we know that this is going to be audited. We found that we had neglected to bring a staff report, and again, timely discussion. Back in June, there was a staff report approved for the Corrections Guild, and it had kind of earmarked funding for their bonus program. And there's a line in there that says that they would use $400,000 of ARPA funding for their bonus program. And then we actually programmed that into the budget. However, we did not bring a staff report. All of the grants, all of the programs that have been committed to by council have a staff report. So
Is it in a decision package, though, for the budget?
it is, but it doesn't have a specific staff report.
I don't think let's talk about that. I don't think we need a separate staff report since the council, we have the decision package that calls it out, and council already approved that. So that.
And I understand that as part of the budget. However, we can bring this back. There was a staff report that was prepared, and I think it got lost in the transition when our HR director left, because it was right at the end of November. And so I would suggest to be consistent with all of the other documentation we have. And really, it's just a ratification of what council has already approved. So heads up, that may be coming, but the county manager and I can discuss that.
I have a question. Is that reflected in the?
Yes.
It's reflected there.
Yeah, it doesn't change anything other than help our documentation standards be consistent. So.
I believe that concludes the questions for today then. Does it not, Mark?
All the questions I have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for this informative report, and it's wonderful to know precisely where we stand, because then we're able to move forward even more. So thank you. We are going to take a 5-minute break before moving into councilor reports. So that would be coming back at 10:36, and we'll see you then. We are back with council time and ready to begin councilor reports. I think that we may have several today. Would you like to begin with law and justice, Councilor Medvigi?
Well, that was completely off my radar screen. So I had a planned presentation in a different area.
Well, what is that area? Why don't you go for that?
Thank you. And so I apologize for that, but I would just say that law and justice is one, we're going to revisit the ordinance as we need to do in other committees and boards. It's an ancient one, and some of the membership, and it's come up from time to time, is, what are we doing? What are we supposed to be doing? In any case, we hope to do that not only with law and justice, but I think other boards and committees may be ripe for reviewing that. We had, I'm drawing a blank on what the presentation is. Amber would probably do a better job on that, since
We had a pretrial presentation from district court for their program.
And as well, you probably know at ECHO, we had the presentation from community court, which is something we had at Law and Justice as well previously. There's a lot going on, and so I'm going to skip to the one I was really prepared to present on, because it's a policy issue, a policy decision, and so I wanted to have an open discussion briefly to see if there are 3 counselors that want to move forward. Prior to the pandemic and having the most rural district, I started hearing right away about gaps in service, no service at all for high-speed internet in a lot of the rural areas in the county. And then I started hearing about poor service, the lack of vendors, and even in the Camas-Washougal area, you would think that there was pretty well-developed internet service, and started to hear there was a lot of dead areas, not just in the rural areas, but even among the Battleground and Camas-Washougal city areas. So I started trying to push for broadband expansion with our service providers, and working with our own public works, some of the mundane issues. Okay, are you prioritizing right-of-way excavation to lay cable? And the answer came back from, at that time, the Public Works Director, yes, we are. The issue of permit fees did not come up. But there was very little that we really were doing. And then I had a service provider in the East County come forward and say, you know, we're really running into a stone wall and moving forward. A young entrepreneur had come up from Oregon, but with a lot of capacity to expand and provide service in the East County. And then we came to find out they had a franchise agreement pending with the county for close to a year. It was like, oh my God, really? What's going on here? Some of that time, or most of that time, was attributed to the PA's office, not really knowing what a franchise agreement should look like. I think Comcast at the time had the only franchise agreement. A lot of challenges in that regard. Now, it brings us to the current issue. So we had ARPA funding. We allocated when I thought we had done a good job in putting the word out. We were looking for private vendors, providers to provide broadband internet service. All of our utilities had essentially backed off and said, we're not interested. Our ports were interested, and they, through their own individual efforts, started moving forward for emplacement of dark fiber and else. And Port of Kamis-Washougal went a step further, and they hired a consultant on a grant. And I just forwarded that to Amber, which she received yesterday. So there's a lot of initiative to move things forward. But of the available money, infrastructure money that we were anticipating, now is the time to step forward. But Comcast was the only one that submitted a concrete project to compete for ARPA funding, and they were, the RFP went out and they were awarded the grant. I heard from other vendors that they didn't even know there was a process on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? Which takes me to the policy decision. I thought we had already made it in supporting through ARPA funding at least one project. We need to expand. This isn't just a quality of life issue. People need it to work at home. Kids need it to do homework at home, especially in times of pandemic. It's a tool of economic development. I mean, it really has, I think the debate's over. It really has come to the point, it's arisen to be as vital as any other utility like water, sewer, and electricity. So what's percolating right now is the issue of permit fees. Now, we, as a policy decision, have in the past said we're going to recover our costs on permits. There are some permits or some fees that we underwrite for the good of like clean water is one area that we underwrite some of those costs. So the same vendor in East County is basically saying, you know, I can't build here. I can't expand here. I'm going to go to a different other county because it costs me too much per foot to put my infrastructure into the ground or up on the poles. And Lindsay did some research, and basically the outcome was there's a wide variety of counties in Washington that take different approaches. Ours is above the normal as far as costs. There are flat fees. Some counties underwrite fees. We got into the issue of, well, having a dig once policy on the right-of-ways. I think we've got that in place, and there were some communication issues with all of the service providers not being on the list to be notified when a road was going to be ripped up. I think that's now solved. But the issue is this. If we are going to promote this as a public good, what are the actual costs to the county? Are we duplicating services, unneeded services? Because as a policy decision, we've basically said we don't want to do that. You know, what are we experiencing for the county that justifies the per foot cost to our broadband provider. So that's the first question. That's being worked right now by staff. We know what the vendor was going to be charged, and he says it doesn't pencil out, and he's going to a different county. So my position would be this, as a policy decision. This is a good of the public issue. Let's minimize those costs, permitting costs. Let's direct the executive to do that. A flat fee should be considered, a minimal flat fee, whatever is minimally necessary for the public safety to ensure this is done correctly as they excavate our right-of-ways. Or we even absorb that cost. In the emails I sent out for information, I compared and contrasted the $4.6 million that was given for ARPA funds as a match to the Comcast project, and that was roughly 32 miles of fiber and 500 hookups. What Noctel's going to be providing is substantially more. And I can't remember the exact cost of fees that they were being quoted, but it was about $190,000, I think, for even more hookups. So I would propose that we consider waiving those fees entirely, at least reducing it to a flat fee that's minimal in nature. So those are the conversations I've been mainly having by email with not only our manager, but Public Works and this one provider. And obviously there, at some level, there's some proprietary information they don't want to get into. So those conversations need to be held in a more sensitive way. Anyway, I wanted to get the sense for what the council thinks, if they're supporting the expansion of broadband. It's not just the rural area. I mean, there's underserved areas, even in Vancouver, which is pretty well hooked up. You know, there are equity issues. People can't afford the service, and that needs to be solved. And that's the real push by Commerce, State Commerce, and WSU Extension. They're trying to get to this equity issue, you know, making it available to everyone, and especially for low income, but also get it out into areas that the service providers normally wouldn't build into because it doesn't pencil out. That's the gap we're trying to fill through the initiatives, and we have a meeting on Friday that I'm going to be missing, but Amber's going to be leading on behalf of the county and the ports and WSU to move broadband forward, because there are going to be some very large grant rounds coming up that we are going to be well positioned for. We have already achieved some notoriety with WSU Extension that Clark County wants to move forward with broadband expansion. So permitting fees is the issue today. Do we support reducing them, eliminating them, at least looking into, you know, what do we really need to do as a county in charging these fees, because it does cause at least one provider to say, I'm going elsewhere, I can't afford your fees.
If I can also, for council's consideration, I'd recommend maybe doing a work session. I know staff is actually meeting on this and talking about what the fees entail, just so that we have that full understanding before council makes a final decision, because there is some differences regarding overhead installations versus underground, and you know, most of the costs I think are underground, which does require inspections and work and everything. So, and I think on Friday the staff is working through some of that, and so even if we could get it on within the next week or two, I would recommend that.
I would definitely be supportive of that. I think that's the best way to move forward, because just now in this little 2-minute conversation, I had about 20 questions come to mind. So yeah, definitely an appropriate subject for a work session.
I would just say thank you very much for bringing this up and sharing the information. I looked through that, and I would say my entire district is in need of better service. So I'm very much in on that.
I I am too. I think it's a very interesting, and I'm also interested in a work session to discuss.
And
Thank
could
you.
you include in that work session the question that Counselor Medvigi raised on the permitting fees?
Yeah, this will include all costs related to broadband and what it entails and what it's paying for. We shouldn't be
Excellent.
making money off of anything. It should be just the cost of doing business, but they're doing a thorough analysis, so any costs associated with broadband.
Excellent. Looks to me, Counselor Medvigi, if you're supportive of that as well, that it's a unanimous thumbs up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and County Manager and Deputy Manager.
Do you have additional counselor reports, Counselor Medvigi? I know you've been doing a lot of meetings.
I have spoken way too much all morning. I want to
Okay, how
defer
about
to my other
Counselor
counselors.
Beltran? I know you've been to several meetings.
I have. I was at CTRAN last night. There was some interesting topics discussed at the legislative Friday meeting on a couple of bills in particular. There's one bill that has been affecting Thurston County. I'm not sure if any of the other counselors have heard about one of the bills that was introduced that has released sexually violent predators into certain parts of the state into lower security facilities. Currently, it has affected Thurston County, but it will be affecting other counties in the state as a whole because they are planning on spreading these facilities throughout the state. And they said that all the counties should get familiar with this legislation because it could potentially impact everyone. So I was actually going to talk to Josh a little bit more about this so I can learn more about it. But I've been doing some research on it on my own to see kind of what's happening and what's developing with it. So I thought I'd bring that to your attention.
Thank you. That is of concern to council, I am sure.
Yes.
I know you've been to other committees as well. Do you have anything to report from any of them? Such as?
Sounds like CTRAN is working on a lot of different projects and trying to improve current routes that they service people on, specifically the downtown routes, to make it so they're just more effective and efficient to encourage more ridership. And there were quite a few retirements last night that were happening from long-term employees. That was great to hear. There were a couple of employees that had done a lot of work for CTRAN and got to hear about their work history with CTRAN and some of the projects that they'd been involved with. And it was good information. And I just look forward to learning more about CTRAN and all the different things that they're involved in.
Anything else?
No, Madam Chair, that's it for me.
Okay. How about Councillor Young?
Yes, thank you. I've got quite a few to report on. I attended the Urban County Policy Board, and they are currently going through the process of vetting applications and scoring them for CDBG and home funding. So looking forward to this in the next couple of weeks. All of the members of the board will be submitting their scoring on the different applications, and through that process we'll end up with eventually awarding grants out. So excited about that. Oh man, I lose track of time. I think it was the day before yesterday. Councilor Marshall and I were able to attend a dinner for the Cowlitz tribe Foundation, which is a really neat experience. They do some amazing things in our community. I was very grateful to be able to be a guest at that. And not committee related, but I was able to take a tour of the port this week, and I'm very grateful for the executive leadership over at the port to take me on that tour and see what they're up to and see how the county affects the port and the port affects the county and how we all have to work together and how they can be a great driver for economic development in our community. So that was a very interesting experience, and I wanted to thank them for that. Also had the opportunity to meet with our auditor this previous week and many of his staff, including Mark was here earlier. And that was a great experience, learning how they do all of the stuff that they do. And one of the things that, you know, whenever I meet with individuals, I ask them what their needs are, and they had referred to the fact that they have outgrown their facility. So I don't expect a conversation right now, but perhaps some online or offline communication on anything that might be happening with that or not.
Yeah, I can certainly. So Michelle Schuster has been leading a project for the last year on space planning. So she's intimately involved with all of that, have the needs, and eventually we'll come back to council with a recommendation.
Okay, great. Thank you for that update. And that's all I have today, Chair. Thank you.
You bet. Councilor Marshall, do you have any meetings to report on?
Just very briefly, I did attend the Cowlitz Foundation dinner, and also very impressed. I believe they distributed $27 million in their grant program since its inception, and expect it to be up to, I believe, $35 million by the end of this year, so a significant impact. I got a tour of the library and was briefed on the library system, and also briefed by the auditor, so lots of briefings.
Thank you. Yesterday, the council as a whole met and interviewed for the Planning Commission and recommended and approved the appointment of Carl Johnson and Jack Haroon in the two open positions. So we thank everyone who stepped up to the plate to be interviewed because it is a significant time commitment, we know, for a volunteer. And just one other thing that I had mentioned at the CTRAN meeting that some of you may have been seeing and wish to follow up on in the media is that cityobservatory.org and other newspapers are following suit with this to investigate now what ODOT's toll plans are. The word has come through ODOT that the tolling is broken down by bridge, by mileage, and in other ways to come up with the total toll that someone would face. And as an example, if an individual who is from Vancouver works in Wilsonville, it appears that their daily tolls would be $30 a day, which is quite significant when added, of course, to the Oregon income tax that they have to pay when they work in Oregon. So I know that there's going to be a lot more discussion on that, but the discussion is beginning, and it's time to get a dollar figure ascribed to what those tolls might become. And this is just one of the sets of tolls. It's not the total picture, but we'll be getting more on that as well in the very near future. Anything else from other counselors? Okay, let's move to work session requests. Kathleen?
Yes, there is one work session request this morning before council. It's with community planning in partnership with Public Works and other staff. This is regarding the 179th Street Access Management and Circulation Plan. During the end of September of last year, council had asked that the staff go back and review the questions and comments that were received during an open house in August of 2022, And this is something that we don't normally do, but this work session would be interactive with council, staff, and the community to provide an opportunity for them to ask questions and have that interactive discussion regarding 179th Street Access Management and Circulation Plan. We're looking at the end of March for about an hour and a half.
That sounds excellent, and we've of course had the chance already to review part of the staff report, or maybe all of the staff report on that, and there's a lot to learn from what people say, for sure. So, yes.
I would just like to say I appreciate the opportunities for the community to be involved. It's having a big impact in the community, and I know there's a lot of concerns, so I'm grateful for that.
Any other comments? And we look forward to the work session. Kathleen, thank you. Policy issues.
So I'll just do a quick update on the applications. We have received 7 applications for our policy analyst position, and some of them actually looked pretty good. So we'll continuing to receive some, and then as soon as we're ready and have enough qualified people, I'll be asking council who wants to join on the interview panels for that. The council does continue to meet weekly with our lobbyists as the legislature is in session at this time. And I'm also working on some of the policy items that were presented during the retreat this year, trying to get a way of, or making sure that we don't forget things. So trying to get them online, transparent, a summary, where we're at, where we're going, so that we have that real-time information and ensure it just doesn't sit on a piece of paper for another year. So I'll be sharing more information in the future regarding that.
Thank you. Executive sessions are 2 in number today. The first one is dealing with pending litigation from RCW 42.30.110, Section 1I, which will take about 20 minutes, followed by collective bargaining, which will be about 10 minutes. And my understanding, Leslie Lopez, if you would confirm that there is no after action following these discussions.
Thank you, Chair Behrman. That is correct. There's no after action today.
Okay, so this will take about 30 minutes. It is now 11:04. Let's strive for returning to this session to close down council time today at 11:40. And councilors, see you in the other session.
Hello, council is extending their executive session for 10 more minutes and will now be returning at 11:50. Thank you. Hello, council is extending their executive session for another 10 minutes and will now be reporting back at noon. Thank you. The council is extending their executive session for 10 more minutes and will now be returning at 12:10. Thank you.
Chair Behrman, I believe you are muted.
Thank you so much. We have been in recess from council time on Wednesday, February 15, for 2 items in the executive sessions, one of pending litigation, one of collective bargaining. We are completed with both of those items in terms of their discussion. We have no after action or after action type of report. So we're back in council time for the singular purpose of adjournment. So with that, this meeting is adjourned.